Emeka Egbuka is Ohio State's all-time leading receiver. But what does that mean for his dynasty value? We'll tell you on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on X at Kate Madjuk. And on today's show, we're taking a look at one of the more difficult receivers to figure out in this class. It's Emeka Egbuka, the Ohio State all-time leading receiver. And yet he was never the best receiver at Ohio State ever during his entire career. But Kate, I want to start with the film. What did you see from Egbuka when you put on his tape?
You see reliability. You see a safe kind of every down chain mover who has some finesse as a route runner. He's, I think, just a generally well-rounded wide receiver. But Marcus, you mentioned, was never the number one wide receiver at Ohio State. But hey, when we look at some of the competition there on the football field, it starts to make sense a little bit, right? Emeka Egbuka, one of the most, just generally, I think, safe floor receivers in this class. He's 22 years old, a senior, former 5-star recruit, was the number one wide receiver recruit in the 2021 class, 6 foot, 202 pounds. So not the biggest dude, but I think he wins just in his ability as a natural receiving weapon in the receiving game.
So we're going to talk about some comps later in the show, but I kind of have to do it up front because one of the most common comps for Egbuka is Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who played with Egbuka back in the 2022 season, I believe. Mm-hmm. How do you compare and contrast their games? Because I think Egbuka is more explosive, but I also wonder if he has to play inside like JSN. When you watched both of these guys, how would you compare and contrast them?
I think when we're looking at Emeka in general, I'm projecting him as a player that is probably going to mostly play out of the slot. But here's the thing, Marcus, we kind of had the same thing about JSN coming out of OSU. They play very similarly. In the one season they did play together. Emeka was playing a little bit more on the outside than we saw him do over the past 2 seasons. But I think where you see him kind of raise that floor significantly is when he plays out of the slot. And that was something very similar to what we see with Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Now, we don't really have a test case just yet for Jaxon Smith-Njigba. I think we're projecting him to maybe play a little bit more on the outside this year with the addition of Cooper Kupp there in that Seattle offense. But how will that translate? I don't know. But I do think in general, what you're going to get with Egbuka is a very safe floor, because I think he does a lot of things really, really well. Maybe lacks elite traits. He's not an elite athlete, but he's a really good athlete. He's got some really nice long speed that's going to, give you some upside especially in the intermediate game. I think he's fantastic intermediate receiver. But
can I go through some of my notes that I have on him really quickly? Because I think one of the things that's interesting, he doesn't drop the ball, 5% career drop rate. I think he's a good route runner. I think he's really good in zones. And I think that's where he shows up the best is he just knows where to find the soft spot in a zone, and he presents himself open. You see him being able to win with different routes and being able to beat press coverage. So there is a lot that you like. Plus, I think he can track the ball well down the field. I think he's a good enough player after the catch. He's not elite, but he's good enough to at least give you some value there. To me, Kate, he's like a box checker, right? You look at somebody who has 4 years of experience, and even with all of the receivers he's played with, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Marvin Harrison Jr., Jaxon Smith-Njigba, Jeremiah Smith, he's managed to be productive with all of those guys there. Now, I think if you were to stack all those receivers, he probably would come in at the bottom of those. But we're still talking about a guy that was really good and productive when he was playing with NFL talent. So you can't knock him too much here.
I mean, that's the thing. I know that maybe when we're stacking these guys up, one against the other, he might be at the lower end, but you're also stacking him against, I think, what is a truly elite tier of wide receivers. OSU is not LSU wide receiver university, but
it's pretty close,
right? So like, if we're saying Emeka Egbuka is not as talented or isn't in the same tier as a Garrett Wilson or a Chris Olave, like, I think that's fair, but I also think we're talking about a very high tier of wide receivers. So like, it's still, above, I think, a lot of players in maybe that mid wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 range that we're going to find in Dynasty right now. I think the floor is pretty safe. And depending on the landing spot, the ceiling could be pretty high. We saw with Jaxon Smith-Njigba, even playing primarily a slot role this year, because of his sort of archetype and the role that he plays within the offense as this chain mover. He could be especially, productive in fantasy, especially for like full PPR scoring formats, because he's going to be the target guy. And I think Emeka's very similar in that way.
Yeah, and I think we'll talk about some landing spots here in a little bit, but I could just see a situation where he lands with the right quarterback and the quarterback just falls in love with him. Kind of like what we saw with Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey, where Ladd McConkey, like, physically isn't anything spectacular. The stats coming out of Georgia weren't anything great, but he just gets open all the time, and Justin Herbert instantly fell in love with that, right? So you put Egbuka with the right quarterback, and again, I've got a team that I want to match him up here in a second. I can see him having a really successful NFL career. But Kate, let's talk about some of the weaknesses here, because he's not a perfect prospect. What were some of the things that you saw on tape from him that have you a little concerned?
I mean, let's start with the fact that, again, as we had already mentioned, he has primarily played the slot receiver role earlier on in his career at OSU, played more frequently along the outside. But I mean, this past season at OSU, I think something like 90% of his snaps were played out of the slot. So we're not looking at a typical boundary receiver. He's not an X guy. He's not going to be the physical, imposing matchup. But yeah, let's say that is a knock, right? Because maybe that limits his overall ceiling. If you're not going to have a team using a ton of 3 wide receiver sets, he's just not going to see the field enough. And we saw that a little bit with JSN early on. Not too dynamic after the catch, but again, not bad. Kind of average in that regard.
Average.
He can, yeah. I think it's hard to find any major red flags with Emeka Egbuka at this point.
Yeah, I don't think there's like a red flag where now we're knocking him and taking him out of like round 1 or anything like that. But I do see somebody who is a good NFL athlete, but not an elite one. And I think that's my concern is like, okay, you come into the NFL, you're going to be playing against 4-3 corners every single Sunday. Are you going to be able to create that same separation that you did at Ohio State? Or are you going to just have to be a zone receiver where teams scheme up ways to get you the football? That's one of my concerns. We mentioned the slot stuff. Didn't play a lot on the outside. Doesn't really have a lot of experience playing press coverage. They also, Ohio State did some stuff to try to get him touches, whether it was like motioning him and just giving him these little drag routes. Again, we're talking about little concerns. My issue with Egbuka is, what is his one trait that's going to make him different than other receivers in the first round? Like, what's that one winning trait that he has? I just don't know. And I think that's why maybe I'm a little bit lower on him compared to the consensus.
Here's what I had mentioned to you before we recorded, Marcus. Emeka Egbuka, I think, is so good at a lot of things, right? He's like, let's say B, and all these different categories that you're going to evaluate him as a wide receiver. But he doesn't have any A pluses. And I do think that generally speaking is something that maybe you're going to be concerned about from like a ceiling perspective. Mm-hmm. But it is a player that I think when you're looking at the NFL, when you have When you're at 90% for all these different categories, but maybe you're not 100% in any, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, especially when we're projecting his value for fantasy.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the analytics, and we'll talk about some team fits for Emeka Egbuka. I almost say JSN. That's almost a Freudian slip. Let's talk about Emeka Egbuka's analytics next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you a chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's 200 extra bucks that you could use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories to even who's cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a few underdogs that are going to play this weekend. I know we haven't had very many upsets so far, but I think we're going to get them now that we're in the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8. And FanDuel is making it easy to back them with spreads, totals, and game props. And with tournament games happening almost every single day, there's always something exciting to bet on. Plus, the FanDuel app is simple to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly, no waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Okay, let's talk about Emeka Egbuka, some of the analytics here. What do the analytics tell us about the all-time leading receiver at Ohio State?
Well, let's first take a look at some of just the face value box counting store stats, because, true freshman didn't really have any sort of impact. 191 receiving yards, but saw him break out here really early on here as a true sophomore. Over 1,100 receiving yards, 10 touchdowns, added another 87 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns on the ground. I'm going to be honest, that is the kind of kicker for me when I'm looking at Emeka Egbuka and I'm saying, what is his ceiling? I'm looking at that early breakout as a true sophomore at Ohio State and saying, that's going to tell me something, because, maybe not necessarily the most dominant. You're not going to love his college dominator rating, 42nd percentile for wide receivers. Not fantastic. But then again, like, when you're looking at what he accomplished in an offense as talented as that of Ohio State, that is something that's intriguing. He's OSU's all-time leading receiver, 2 seasons of 100 or 1,000 plus receiving yards, 10 touchdowns, has that special teams experience. And yeah, I think in general, the production profile is just something that is quite exciting for me.
Yeah, you don't get very many receivers at Ohio State that are putting up 1,100-yard seasons as sophomores. So that's really good. We always love the receivers that are breaking out early in their college career, and that's Egbuka. Now, the production dipped. Again, part of that is because of the talent that was there. Like, he just was never going to get more targets than Marvin Harrison Jr. The quarterback play was pretty rough in 2023 as well.
He was also injured. Had a couple of injuries there through the 2023 season that I think were in part to blame for some of that step back. But again, when you look at a second year breakout, he was 19.9. That's his technical breakout age, which isn't like super, super impressive, but I'm looking more at the actual breakout age here. I just think in general, having that kind of production as a true sophomore is impressive, but it's all the more impressive when you consider the talent that he played with around him.
All right, let's look at the stable metrics via Pro Football Focus. 78th percentile receiving grades. These are from the 2023 and 2024 season. 95th percentile separation percentage. I would caution you a little bit on that number, because a lot of this is Ohio State making sure that he's open. But that's good. At least it checks that box.
They're gimmicking him open.
Yeah,
but you know
exactly.
what, Marcus? I just love that they look at Emeka as a guy that they want to generate touches for.
Bingo. Yep. 63rd percentile yards per route run, 79th percentile drop percentage, 59th percentile yards after the catch per reception. And we mentioned that in the previous segment. Like, he's good after the catch, but he's not special. I think he's just very average, which is fine. So again, he's a box checker as a receiver. Production, the advanced metrics. He's got good size. He plays at a good school. But what is that defining winning trait? I'm not quite sure.
Marcus, you're just getting greedy, I think.
Well,
we're getting greedy.
Here's the thing. I'm biased. I'm as a Cowboy fan picking at number 12. I really wanted there to be like this awesome wide receiver prospect for the Cowboys to pick, and I was hoping that it was going to be Egbuka. And I like him. I truly like him, but I think of him more as like a solid number 2 receiver rather than somebody who could be like the focal point of your offense.
I think that's fair. But I also look at the rest of this class, and I'm wondering how many players can we project to be a true number 1 wide receiver? I know, Tetero McMillan, not your favorite wide receiver in this class, but I think you have to admit that he's probably the only one out of all of these guys that we can look and say, do I think they can come into an offense, be the number 1 guy, be that X?
Yeah.
I think he's probably the only one we can say that about definitively without a ton of questions right now.
All right, so let's talk about some landing spots, because I'm of the belief that I don't think he's going to go inside the top 20 picks. I think he's more likely to be either a late first rounder or a second rounder. So is there any team that stands out for you as like a really strong fit that would help his dynasty value?
In terms of strong fits, I do think Denver's a team that is fairly intriguing to me, picking at number 20, mostly because of the fact that I think, they have Cortland Sutton. I think they need a guy that they can maybe just generate some easier touches for. I like the idea of him in this Sean Payton offense where we know that he can use kind of the Joker role. He can generate touches. He can scheme up plays for a particular player. And I think that's kind of what intrigues me about Emeka, because I do think once you get the ball in his hands, good things are going to happen for your offense. And when I'm looking at the coaches and I'm saying, which of these coaches in a range would I trust to, make it a point to get the ball in his hands? I think Sean Payton could be that guy. And he seems to kind of fit a need that they don't really have an Emeka type receiver in that offense just yet.
I'm going to go through a couple more. I think the Chargers are an interesting one. He can come in, he can block really well. I think that makes sense stylistically. Not sure that's a great fit for him personally. I think my favorite fit though, Kate, is Houston, where he reunites with CJ Stroud, who he had the monster season with. And I actually think his game and Nico Collins would fit really well, because you could play Egbuka in the slot. Nico is the outside receiver, and you're just running the whole offense underneath through Egbuka. I know that's a weird one in the sense that he wouldn't be the number 1 receiver there, but we know CJ Stroud loves him. And with Tank Dell missing the entire 2025 season, with Stephon Diggs gone, they did bring in Christian Kirk, but that's on a 1-year rental. I think Egbuka with Houston at 25 makes a ton of sense.
Definitely makes a ton of sense, and I think would really fill a need that Tank Dell leaves in this offense. They might both be able to play out of the slot, but Tank Dell, because of his ability to separate when he is healthy, like you can play him on the outside if you want. You can play him deep down the field. Egbuka, I think, can just kind of fill this consistent role, and we already know there's that built-in rapport there. So I'm kind of a fan.
I won't be surprised if Egbuka falls a little bit in this draft, and he's the guy that's being drafted like top of the second round. And at that point, it makes sense. Like, let me give you an example. If the Giants take Shedeur Sanders at pick number 3, and they draft Emeka Egbuka at pick 34, and he's like playing as the number 2 with Malik Neighbors, I love that fit. I think that's fantastic. Same for Cleveland. If Cleveland takes Shedeur and now he's playing with Jerry Jeudy as the number 2 receiver, I think that makes a lot of sense as well. I just don't see very many situations, Kate, where he's going to walk in and be the wide receiver 1. And frankly, I don't see that many situations where you even project 2-3 years from now where he's going to be the top target getter on a good offense.
Here's the thing, though. When I'm looking at potential landing spots, Marcus, I don't know that there are a ton of landing spots for Emeka Egbuka that I'm saying, ooh, that seems like a bad fit.
That's true. I will give you that. It seems like almost any of those teams, once you get to 20 and beyond, you could squint and be like, okay, I can see how that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that is a testament to just the fact that he is a pretty safe floor guy. So again, if this is the draft that you're looking for ceiling players, you should probably look elsewhere. But in terms of the floor, I love the fact that I look at the skill set of Emeka Egbuka. I think, all right, there's not, there's no glaring holes in his game. I don't think.
No.
I look at the potential draft spots, and he seems like he could be a complementary fit in most situations that I can imagine him being drafted. So like, I kind of like that.
There is some safety there in his value, right? Because I do think he seems like the type of receiver to me, Kate, that coaches and quarterbacks are going to love.
Mhm.
I'm not so sure about dynasty players, but it won't shock me of like, hey, he got drafted by Houston and he's playing 98% of the snaps in Houston's offense. Like that won't shock me either. And I think on top of playing 4 years at Ohio State and being productive in those 4 years, I've got to imagine that he's going to be ready to go right out of the gate, which again is really a good thing for his dynasty value.
I think you're just bored because he's a pretty well-rounded prospect, Marcus.
I mean, there might be part of that as well. Let's be honest. Let's talk about his dynasty value, where he's being drafted among receivers, where he's being drafted in rookie drafts. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day, and find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, Kay, let's talk about his dynasty value right now. Where is he being drafted in rookie drafts? Too high, too low? What do you think?
When you look at his ADP right now in Dynasty rookie drafts here, let's look at first Superflex rookie drafts, because I do think it's kind of an interesting time to be in the mix in a Superflex draft, because there's not, a ton of quarterbacks that are really pushing players up. And all that to say, he's going 8th overall in Superflex drafts, which I think feels about right when you look at the players going ahead. You have Ashton Genty, Amarian Hampton going 1 and 2 overall, Cam Ward, Tetaroa McMillan, Trevion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins. Then you have QB2, Shedeur Sanders, followed by Emeka Egbuka. There are some players behind him. And again, I'm looking at the Tyler Warrens. I'm looking at the Travis Hunters, the Colston Lovelands that I think.
I'm just throwing out Travis Hunter until we know. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, but we still have to talk about it.
I know.
I think
it's just
the
because then
that
the tight end, right? It's because you want to draft the tight ends over him.
I kind of do. If I'm having a positional need, because I do think that these are going to be true, like blue chip.
They feel like guys are going to be top 6 tight ends by the end of their rookie years, right?
Fairly easily. And I think they're just going to kind of sit there for the years to come. So I think those are probably the players that I'm looking at. And I'm saying, all right, well, I don't know if I can maybe get past the perceived lack of ceiling for Egbuka. And, when I'm considering him against some of these tight ends, but otherwise, I have to imagine, Marcus, you're looking at his ranking among wide receivers, which is wide receiver 2 in the latest batch of Dynasty ADP. T-Mac going number 1, going ahead of Luther Burden, Matthew Golden, Travis Hunter, Trey Harris. How does that feel?
High. Because Luther Burden's my number 1 receiver in this class. Now, I think Tet's my number 1 from a dynasty perspective. In the actual NFL draft, it's Burden. I can't get there. But again, in a rookie draft, in a super flex rookie draft, or you're telling me he's going like 10, 11, 12, I understand. But I think
that's fair.
But I think
maybe let's talk about the guys behind him then. So you're not on board with him over Luther Burden, obviously. Not on board with him over T-Mac. What about Matthew Golden, who we talked about on Monday's show, a wide receiver that, has a lot of really nice traits, coming off a solid season at Texas, but somebody whose production was largely pretty concentrated to the college football playoffs, and a player that has he's almost the opposite type of player in terms of production history. Like, I'm going to take Emeka 40 times over out of 40 times over a Matthew Golden.
So I went and did some research yesterday after the show. If you look at since 2020, there have been 28 receivers drafted in round one, right? I think there could potentially be 4 drafted this year. Matthew Golden has the lowest yards per game in the best season, which is 2024 for him, of any of those receivers, 61 yards per game. Players like Quentin Johnston, who was directly above him, 76 yards per game. Jalen Reagor, 81 yards per game. We're talking about like all-time bad production for Matthew Golden. So yeah, I know that Golden ran a 4.29. I don't care. He doesn't play that way. I think Emeka is just a better player. Give me Emeka.
I think I think the thing for me. I'm looking at Emeka and I'm saying, I just think he's a really good football player. I think he's a good football player. I think he's a good receiver. And maybe that doesn't scream sexy, like top 5 dynasty upside, but I'm also not looking at this 2025 receiving class as the place where I'm going to find top 5 dynasty wide receiver upside.
How many places do you think he could go that would raise his dynasty stock? We're instead of him being drafted at like 10th overall, he's getting drafted at 8th. Is there any place out there, if you're looking at like the first 40 picks of the draft, that would get you that excited to move him up?
That's a great question. What if he went to a place like Buffalo at 30?
I think
maybe a duplicative skill set with Khalil Shakir a little bit, but he's bigger, and I think he can do more in the intermediate receiving game. I know they just invested in Keon Coleman last season, but I don't know that there's anything that you've seen from Keon Coleman.
No, it's just the thing that worries me is that Buffalo has so many weapons that are all kind of the same caliber, whether it's Dalton Kincaid, Dawson Knox, Keon Coleman, and I think they just do a really good job of spreading the ball out. Like I understand the thinking, like it wouldn't be that hard for him to be the best receiver on that team by 2026. I'm just not sure how much that matters right now. I've got one for you.
Okay.
What if, let's go with the assumption that Cam Ward is the number 1 overall pick with the Titans, because I think that's pretty likely. And that Tennessee turns around and drafts Egbuka at 35. And now he's paired with Cam Ward because Calvin Ridley's now into his 30s. He's not been able to stay healthy. Treylon Burks is a non-factor. I think there's a chance that Egbuka is just the leading receiver on that team right away with a quarterback that we like quite a bit. I think that is one of the few spots where I could be like, you know what? I could talk myself into him being a number 1 receiver there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I don't know that I'm looking at him as a type of player that I need to be a top 5 wide receiver, because that's just not my expectations for this class in general. So maybe because I have some lower expectations for the overall ceiling of this receiving class, I'm able to kind of temper the rest of my expectations. Let's say he went to a place like the Green Bay Packers, picking at 23.
It just feels like another guy there, right? Like
but my question is he day 1 the best receiver in that offense?
Are you really making me pick somebody over Dontavian Wicks? Is that what you're trying to make me do here?
Absolutely.
Probably, but it's the same thing that I have the issue with Buffalo. There's so many similarly talented players that I wonder.
Maybe not a ton of places that he's going to gain a ton of value, but
I don't see
the fact that I think he fits in so many different respective offenses that I think he'd be a guy that, let's say you do your rookie drafts ahead of the NFL draft, if you're kind of wild like that.
Yep.
He's a player that I feel like I could pull the trigger on even earlier in that kind of situation, because I feel like regardless of the range of outcomes, I think the results will be fairly similar for a player like Emeka.
Do you have a comp for Egbuka before we head out?
I think the closest thing is probably JSN, and I struggle with that. They are very similarly sized players. I think we saw them play very similar roles in Ohio State's same offense. So I
think that's like the higher end projection, right? If you can get to be JSN, I think we would all be thrilled with that, right?
Oh, you mean JSN, who's like a top 15 dynasty?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you can get to be JSN, we'll all be thrilled. my comp for him is Jacoby Myers, who's been a good receiver for the Raiders and the Patriots. Now, I think he is a little bit more athletic than Myers, but I think you're getting that caliber of receiver. Unfortunately for Jacoby Myers, he's just been saddled with the worst quarterback situation wherever he's gone. So maybe if he ends up with a better quarterback play, which he gets Geno now, you can see it being a better situation. But that's kind of the player I see here.
I think that seems like a good one.
Okay. All right. That is it for today's show. We'd like to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. On tomorrow's show, it's a Matt Williamson show, so make sure you get your Twitter questions in. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Modjuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.